The first time he saw her, she was curled up beside a rusted water pump, clutching her stomach like it hurt to breathe. Dust from the saloon drifted down the street like ash, and folks passed her by without a second glance, as if she were no more than a shadow stitched to the edge of town. No name, no home, and nothing but a worn-out shawl and eyes too proud to beg. He stood across the road, leaned on the post of his horse, and said nothing. He never did. The town called him Ghost, not because of any crime, but because he moved like he wasn't really there. Some folks feared him. Others whispered he'd lost his voice after the war. No one knew for sure, and he never corrected them. But what no one noticed, what only she saw, was the way he looked at her. Not with pity. Not like the preacher who'd left her scraps. Not like the sheriff who'd told her to move on or get locked up. He looked at her like she mattered. That evening, as the sun sank behind the butte and the sky bled into fire, he rode by again. He stopped his horse, dismounted slow, and knelt beside her. From his saddlebag, he pulled out a blanket, then bread, then a flask of clean water. Still, he didn't speak, just unwrapped the bread and placed it in her hands. She didn't ask where it came from. She didn't have to. She didn't cry. Not yet. Days passed. He returned every night, always without a word, always with food. One evening she finally asked, "Why?" He looked at her, long and quiet, then tapped his chest. Not in some poetic gesture, but simple and honest. Then he handed her a small tin of beans, warm from his fire. "Ghost," she whispered. "Ain't no one ever fed me just 'cause they wanted to." He tilted his head slightly. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. She learned his rhythm. When he rode into town for supplies, he always brought back something extra. A comb, a clean handkerchief, a pair of boots that fit her too well to be random. And though he still never spoke, his actions built a language of their own. By the end of the month, she walked beside his horse instead of sitting alone. They shared meals by the fire under a cottonwood tree west of town. He'd nod when she talked, laugh soundlessly when she joked, and sometimes, when the stars were out, he'd take out a harmonica and play something so sad it made her eyes burn. One night she reached across the fire and touched his hand. "You don't have to speak. I hear you." He didn't pull away. Come winter, they were living out on his land, a stretch of golden field hugged by red rock. He built a porch she could sit on in the mornings. He planted sunflowers along the fence. Folks in town stopped whispering. Some nodded respectfully when they saw her ride in beside him, head high. One day, while feeding the chickens, she turned to find him watching her, holding something behind his back. A ring. Simple, handmade. Worn metal but carved with care. He didn't kneel. He didn't ask. He just opened his palm and looked at her the same way he had the first day. Like she mattered. She said yes without a word. They never talked about the starving days, never named the pain. But every time he wrapped his arms around her at night, she remembered. Not all heroes ride in with guns blazing. Some ride in silent, steady, and love you like no one else ever could. The wedding wasn't held in a church. There were no guests, no preacher. Just the two of them under the cottonwood where they'd once shared beans and bread, and where she had once, quietly, come back to life. She wore a white dress stitched from curtains she'd found in town. He wore the same dusty coat he always had, but he'd shaved, and his hair was combed back with an almost boyish precision. He held her hands in both of his thumbs brushing her knuckles, and when she said, "I do," he just nodded, slow and certain, like he'd waited his whole life to hear it. They built a life in the hush of wide-open plains. Each morning, She'd open the shutters to a sky so blue it made her breath catch. He'd be out with the cattle by dawn, always quiet, always steady, a man made of earth and wind and promise. Sometimes he'd leave her little gifts, wild flowers left on her pillow, blackberries in a tin, or sketches he'd carved into soft wood. A cabin, a horse, her face. She taught him to write, just his name at first, then hers, then whole sentences. He never said a word aloud, but now he had a voice, a pencil, a page, a way to tell her everything. One night, by the fire, he handed her a note. "You don't have to be strong anymore. I'll be strong for the both of us." She didn't know a heart could break and heal at the same time. But peace doesn't last forever in the West. Come spring, a railroad crew arrived near town. With them came men, loud, drunk, careless, who didn't care much for boundaries or respect. One evening, she rode into town alone for flour and mail. They cornered her outside the general store, 3 of them. One grabbed her wrist, one pulled her shawl, the third said things she hadn't heard since the worst of her old days. Before she could scream, a boot thudded hard behind them. The cowboy was there. No words, just a stare. They laughed at first, until he moved. It was over in seconds, a blur of fists and dirt and fear. He left 2 of them bloodied, one crawling. The sheriff said nothing, just looked at Ghost, then nodded once, and walked away. He didn't look at her until it was done. When he did, he didn't seem angry, only shaken. As if the idea of someone hurting her again had torn something open inside him. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest. His heart was pounding. "I'm all right," she whispered. His eyes closed. That night, he sat out on the porch long after the stars came out. She joined him, wrapped in his coat, resting her head on his shoulder. "I used to think no one would ever fight for me," she said. He took her hand and wrote on her palm with his finger. "I would burn the world before I let it take you again." Seasons passed. The land changed colors, but his love never did. Sometimes she'd catch him staring at her while she worked, or hummed, or just smiled at the wind. And though he still never spoke, his gaze said it all. "You're safe. You're wanted. You're home." And though no one ever heard him speak a word, she knew better than anyone. He loved louder than most men ever dared. Years passed like wind over wheat. They never had children. They never needed to. The land was their child. The ranch, the fences they mended together, the field of sunflowers she planted by the porch, where he'd sit every morning with a hand-rolled cigarette and watch her hum as she fed the hens. He never spoke a word, but she never once doubted his voice. He grew slower with time. His joints ached. The swing of the axe came lower. His hands, once so sure, began to tremble when tying rope. But still, he worked. Still, he'd rise at dawn and kiss her forehead without lips, only touch, as soft as falling dust. One winter evening, the wind howled crueler than it had in years. The stove inside their little cabin burned hot, and she was mending his old coat by the fire. He reached for his harmonica, the one he hadn't played in a long time. And there it was, the old tune, the sad one he'd once played for her under the cottonwood tree. But this time, something in it felt different, slower, like goodbye. When he finished, he handed her a piece of paper. His handwriting was shaky but clear. "If the silence ever becomes too loud, just play this song. I'll be listening." She didn't cry. Not then. He passed in his sleep. Peaceful. Face turned toward the window, his hand still wrapped around hers beneath the quilt. The town rang the church bell at dawn. They didn't say ghost anymore. They called him the quiet man who loved like thunder. At the funeral, the preacher asked if anyone wanted to say a few words. No one stepped forward. not even her. Instead, she pulled his harmonica from her pocket and played the tune. Every man in that crowd lowered his head. Even the wind seemed to hush. She kept the ranch. Kept the porch swing, the sunflowers, and the carved initials he'd etched into the barn. She'd sit out there most evenings, bundled in his coat, and read aloud from his old letters. And though no one was there, she'd smile as if he still were. Because deep down, she knew. Love like his doesn't leave. It lingers. It watches. It waits. She was starving when he found her. Now she fed the earth with memory. And every night, under that wide western sky, the wind carried his silence, still louder than words.